Great reporting as always, Anthony, and it's always great to update our viewers about the Larry Nassar case. In fact, if you want to watch a documentary about that, go to NBC Universal's Watchback app and look for Law and Crime. We have a documentary about the Larry Nassar situation up there now if you want to learn a little bit more, and we'll always update you about what is happening. And again, always go to lawandcrime.com to follow the top trending stories of the day. But right now, let's talk about one of our main trials, and let's specifically talk about the Carl Wimpy Jr. case. And here to help me break down what's been happening and what we can expect, I have a very special guest who's joining us in studio, trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, great to see you back here on the program.
Great to see you too, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
So let's break down what's happening here. He's facing felonious assault, murder, and now maybe voluntary manslaughter. Based upon what we've seen from the defense and the prosecution, do you think he could be found guilty of any of those charges?
I think he can definitely be found guilty of the felonious assault. It's just an assault during an unlawful act, which clearly this was. The murder and voluntary manslaughter is more challenging. I mean, it's unfortunate that there's a death here, but it's a barroom brawl. And even though they talk about how intent isn't necessarily required, you can't fault a person for possibly defending himself, which is another claim, because something tragic resulted from it. So I don't think the jury finds murder or voluntary manslaughter.
Well, I'll tell you, the defense doesn't want him found guilty of anything, and that's a big point that we saw yesterday. But before we play some of the testimony from yesterday, let's begin with the defense's opening statement, where you can hear for their own narrative of what happened and why they believe their client was acting in self-defense. Was the defendant just trying to save his life? Was he acting in self-defense? Brad, here's the problem, and you tell me. Is Mr. Carl Wimpy Jr. the innocent party here? Because we can't forget he left the bar and then came back in and threw the punch at Mr. Vasquez, which precipitated this. So how can we really side with the defense on there if he had the option to walk away?
That's the question I've been looking at as I follow the case, because when he left the first time, it's alleged that Vasquez threw some bottles at him. He could have just kept going. Richter. Right. He could have just kept going. Wimpy could have just kept going. But he decided to return, and that's when everything went bad. So I think the jury is going to be faced with a tough question of whether or not he should have left, and by his returning, did he actually then take more of an aggressive, more of an intentional stand to cause harm?
Okay, well, let's see what the defendant himself said yesterday on the stand about this. I mean, and we see it a lot of times in these self-defense cases, the defendant taking the stand and trying to explain his behavior. So Carl Wimpy Jr. took the stand yesterday. Let's see what he had to say. Okay, so what he's describing right there is the moments that he's focusing on Arthur Richter when Mr. Vasquez, he says, is the one who tried to touch him on the shoulder, tried to get him away, and he just reacted. So, Brad, we're left a little confused here. It's alleged by the prosecution he hit him 6 times, and that was ultimately what caused the death of Mr. Vasquez. Now we're sitting back and thinking, well, if he's in the middle of the fight with Mr. Richter and Vasquez comes up to try to break it up, he's in the middle of fight or flight mode.
Right.
Does the jury think about that and say, well, maybe that is reasonable what he did? How's he supposed to know who his enemy is and who isn't?
I think so, and he was a pretty good witness. You know, he was fluid in his testimony, he seemed comfortable in his recollection, and remember that Vasquez was related to Richter. He was his uncle, so it's unlikely that he was trying to necessarily break up the fight as much as he was more likely to be trying to help or protect his nephew. So it puts more the burden on the prosecutor to say that Wimpy didn't have good reason to almost have to defend himself against these 2 men who kept coming after him.
In other words, if Vasquez was unrelated to both individuals, was just a regular bar patron, this might change the dynamic of the case.
I think so. I think it'd be more reasonable to suspect that maybe Wimpy was more aggressive than necessary, used more violence than reasonably necessary. But here, you can't doubt that Vasquez was going after Wimpy and not after Richter in any way.
Yeah. So, I think there's a bit of confusion anytime you have these kinds of fights. Have you seen a case, and I want to go back to the voluntary manslaughter charge, which is something that we believe the jury may have an option to convict him of. Have you seen a successful prosecution of a manslaughter case in a bar fight like this, or a fight?
No. Usually a manslaughter case is going to come where you're doing something reckless, like driving or tossing knives, or something that you clearly shouldn't be doing, and a death results. If a death results from something that is reasonable or necessary, I don't think you get a voluntary manslaughter.
But isn't fighting reckless?
Well, yes, but they're claiming it was self-defense, and that's why the question that you asked before about when he left, when Wimpy left and then returned, was he necessarily in fear of his life, or did he have the ability to just go? Was he now the aggressor? And I think that's going to be pivotal.
I wonder how much they're going to take into the fact that he could have left, that he was outside the bar and came back in. I'm sure it's something that's going to be in their deliberations. We'll take a quick break, but when we come back, a lot more to discuss. So when the defense's expert was on the stand yesterday, they said that when Mr. Vasquez was thrown to the ground, that's really what precipitated the cause of the death. And their expert said that it was ultimately a stroke that caused the death, while the prosecution, the state's experts, said that it was blunt force trauma to the head. But more importantly, we're trying to understand Mr. Vasquez's role in this fight. Now, I'm back here with Brad Micklin to talk about this. And as we said, one of the options the jury will have is voluntary manslaughter. When you look at the statute, it says that no person, while under the influence of sudden passion or a sudden fit of rage, which is what you could say the defendant was under, but which is brought on by serious provocation occasioned by the victim, so that Mr. Vasquez is the one who brought on this fit of rage, that you can't, you can't, that would incite deadly force, which is maybe what happened. You can't cause the death of another individual. So the idea here is we place the impetus on Mr. Vasquez, so that he was the one that precipitated this causing of this violence. Is that the way I'm understanding this? And is that what the jury is going to ultimately see, that maybe they can get him on voluntary manslaughter?
It's going to be tough because, again, most of the fight was caused by Richter. So Vasquez intervened into that. So I don't know if we're going to be able to tie Vasquez as the cause of this passion or of this altercation. But I still don't think that the jury is going to be able to find that Wimpy acted in a way that either purposely, which is needed for murder, or knowingly, which is needed for voluntary, committed this crime and wanted it to or expected it to lead to murder. That's why everybody says intent's not required, but you still have to have purposely or knowingly done it. And I think that's sort of an intention issue.
Well, I mean, I guess it's all how you frame the argument, right? And that's really what we saw yesterday from the closing arguments. So in case you missed it, here's the prosecution's closing arguments, why they say Mr. Wimpy Jr. is definitely to blame. Okay, so those were the closing arguments, and it should be noted that Arthur Richter Jr. Was found guilty of complicity to murder and inciting violence in connection with starting this bar fight, so he was not off the hook himself. Back here with Brad Micklin. Brad, as we wait for the jury ultimately to begin their deliberations today, I got to ask you, what do you think is the biggest hurdle for the prosecution, the biggest for the defense? And I know we only have a short time left.
It's hard to say without seeing that video. I'd love to see the video. The prosecutor's biggest hurdle is causation, that the assault led to the death, because the medical testimony is confusing on both sides, and I think that really helps the jury find not guilty. For the defense, there's a victim, there's a death, and he caused it. There's no question about that. So they have to find that he did it in such a way that he shouldn't be punished, and that's hard.
It's hard both ways, and the jury's ultimately going to have to decide one way or another. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're talking Tammy Moore. Well, Tammy wants to testify. I'm back here with trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, I got to tell you, what we've been seeing here is a question about whether the prosecution's case is strong enough to successfully prosecute on these kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap charges. What good can come from her testifying?
I don't think any good comes from her testifying. Rarely does a lot of good come from a defendant testifying. I think it has something to do with the fact that we're told that her husband is going to be testifying. And since there's a conspiracy charge, it might be she's getting up there to point the finger first to avoid that.
Well, maybe. It's also possible he might be called as a rebuttal witness by the state. So doesn't it all matter what she testifies to? And I believe that is a live shot. Yeah, that's a live shot in the courtroom right now. So isn't that matter what she testifies to? So if she points the finger at Sidney, the prosecution's going to call him out.
I think so. But I think we would have heard from the defense attorney in the opening statement that it was going to go in some kind of a direction. I don't think that they're going to come with a big surprise and have Tammy say it was my husband without some kind of indication to the jury beforehand, because it would look like a sneaky lawyer trick. It's easy to get up on the stand and said he did it.
Right. I don't know. The Moores are fascinating to study. But it's not just Tammy Moore and Sidney Moore, and we saw the testimony of Irene Moore, Sidney's mother. But now let's show you what happened, because there were supposed to be the Moore children were going to testify, but they were sequestered witnesses. They weren't supposed to see anything from the trial, no live stream, no footage. There was an issue that they broke that order. So what we saw yesterday was the testimony from Deputy Jane Pike, who was the one who actually caught the Moore children, in her words, watching the live stream. Let's see what happened when she testified. Okay, so they're saying that the Moore children basically violated the sequestration order. Now, Brad, that's a big no-no, right?
Yeah, almost always in a trial, witnesses are going to be sequestered. It prevents them from being influenced by what other people have to say, and that you know that their testimony is going to be natural.
So what would be the danger of the children here in this specific case watching the trial?
Because we don't know who's going to be called to testify. I think one of the children were already called or was already called to testify. So you can't have anybody, even if they're going to have contact with other witnesses, you just can't have people being influenced by the testimony of other people.
Especially if you're, I mean, we're not, the children here, they're talking about their mother, right? So that's a big issue here. And we saw that yesterday, Christian Moore, who is the defendant's son, was asked about whether or not he violated this sequestration order, or whether or not he, watched this live stream. That became a big issue. So under penalty of perjury, under oath, what did he have to say? Okay, Brad, he denies watching anything, okay? Denies it. Then, when he's cross-examined, the prosecutor made a good point. He goes, there's cameras throughout this whole courtroom. There's cameras in the room where you were sequestered. You still saying, under penalty of perjury, you didn't watch the live stream because we could see what you were looking at. And he said yes. The judge didn't believe him and said that he violated the sequestration order, wouldn't allow him to testify. So I wonder if there's a question, could he be brought up on perjury charges?
Possibly. I thought it was interesting that the judge had the opportunity, had he wanted to review the tape before making this decision. And he's making a crucial decision because he's preventing a potential witness, whether it's a rebuttal witness or a fact witness, in a murder or not in a kidnapping trial. So the fact that he didn't review the tape suggests that he didn't believe him from the start.
Take it away, the sequestration order. If he was permitted to testify, what do you think he was going to testify to? What do you think these children were going to testify to?
It's impossible to know. I mean, this story is so crazy that, and the family, or at least the parents, seem so crazy that who knows not only what the children would say about their lifestyle or where their parents were that night, but we don't know, because children have such an incentive to lie to protect their parents, and we don't know what they would say and whether or not it's going to be believable anyway.
Because the relationship between Sydney and Tammy is the focal point here.
Right.
It's trying to understand, did she have control over him? Did she influence his decisions? Did she prevent him from moving at one point? I mean, it was an allegation that he came forward in his police interview and said, she handcuffs me to the bed. And some of the evidence they brought out yesterday would show how that was impossible. My question is, we saw the day before this the testimony of her cousin, who came on the stand, said, I was shown a picture by Sydney Moore of Heather Elvis in a condition where she couldn't walk and she couldn't talk. People were wondering whether that meant she was bound or gagged, or whether she was incapacitated in some way. So I was wondering, when Sydney allegedly showed this picture to the cousin at a cookout or a barbecue or something like that, would these kids have come forward and said, well, wait a second, I never saw that, or let me tell you a little bit about this cousin?
It's hard to say because the whole testimony by the cousin, the whole picture issue was strange. I'm assuming there was some kind of pretrial motion that prevented description of what was actually in the photo. So instead he described what he believed she could or couldn't do in the photo, which I also thought was strange because it's hypothetical. He's not certain, he's just guessing at what she could or couldn't do. And then it was questioned that he told his mother that he didn't see the picture, and then he said, well, I lied to my mother. So the whole picture testimony, I think, just threw a wrench into the case because it doesn't make any sense.
But in the prosecution's case against Tammy Moore for kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap, we're wondering what their strongest piece of evidence may be. We'll talk more about that right after this.
Preview.
Right, so a little bit of excitement in the courtroom. When is there not excitement in the Tammy Moore courtroom, to be honest with you? I'm back here with trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, the idea of when he got that tattoo of Tammy on his stomach, and if apparently they can manipulate the dates of that post, that becomes a big issue for the defense's case and the prosecution's case, right?
Probably. I think they're using the tattoo as one example, that she not only had severe control over her husband, but that she was really upset and enraged by the affair that he had. So if the tattoo was, let's say, long before she learned of the affair or long before the affair, then it has nothing to do with it.
Right. So, but isn't it suspicious? So if he got the tattoo after Heather Elvis disappeared, wouldn't that be even more suspicious than if he got it before she disappeared?
I don't know. I don't know if the tattoo, in my opinion, really has that much of a significance. I think the prosecution making it such an issue is just confusing. What does it have to do with whether or not she or the two of them conspired or actually kidnapped this young woman? It doesn't make any sense to me.
We talked about it before our last break, but what do you think really is the most important piece of evidence that the prosecution has presented for a kidnapping or conspiracy to kidnap charge here for Tammy Moore? We're not talking about murder. Those charges were dropped. What do they have on her for kidnapping?
I think, ironically, is the absence of a body. I think the fact that Heather's not here suggests that something happened to her. Why didn't she surface? Why aren't there some remains? Why isn't there evidence of where she is? Which is why I don't think we have a murder charge, because the whole case is circumstantial. But to have a murder charge is circumstantial upon circumstantial. It's first we have to assume there's a body and a death. Then we have to make the jury believe the defendants committed the crime. So you have two levels of problems here. With a kidnapping, it's almost understandable that you wouldn't have a body. And I think that's the strongest piece that they have, is the piece that they really haven't mentioned much.
But how do we know? So if you look at the statute, there's certain specific things that they either need to prove, you know, that they seized her, they confined her, they kidnapped, some way that they had control over her. How do we know it's not a situation? If so, people out there think that the Moores had something to do with her disappearance. They lured her out to an area and they pushed her over the cliff, or into the alligator pit or crocodile pit, which is something people have said that's why there's no evidence of her body. That wouldn't necessarily be kidnapping.
Well, if that were the case, if that were the fact pattern, it might be kidnapping. I mean, abducting and carrying away could be in many different forms. But I think if the jury reads and pays attention to the statute, I don't think they're going to find that the Moores committed any one of these specific elements to it.
So that they're having trouble here in their case.
Yeah, it's a weak case.
And so the defense, you wonder, why are they calling Tammy Moore? Clearly, you would have to imagine she wants to say something. She wants to give the jury something else to consider. I'm wondering if we're getting in the makings of some really huge testimony today.
It could be. The most fascinating thing is that the defense attorney mentioned in the beginning of the case that she was going to testify, which is a horrible step to take, because the case could have gone so badly for the prosecutor that they wouldn't want to put her up. But then it raises a question to the jury, well, if she said she was going to testify, why didn't she? So normally you wouldn't even bring that out in the beginning, because you can bring it out later. So Tammy, must be really just bent on testifying about something. That's why I'm dying to see it.
Right, because always they say you can't, to the jury, just because the defendant didn't testify, you can't use that as a factor in your deliberations. But the fact that you say, hey, she's going to come on the stand, and then she doesn't, that's a problem.
Well, plus jurors are human beings. They're going to wonder why they're not hearing from her. Even if she took the Fifth Amendment, or even if the judge instructs that she doesn't need to testify, jurors are still going to wonder why she didn't. It's just human nature. But when you say she's going to testify and then she doesn't, it forces the question.
Yeah, jurors are human beings, and they don't miss any point. All right, we have our first witness of the day. Let's go live. Welcome back, everybody. We're live in the South Carolina courtroom, and this is the trial of Tammy Moore. Sydney Moffitt is on the stand. She lived with Heather Elvis, the victim, at a certain point in time, and she came to live with her because Heather's boyfriend at the time, Jeremy, was apparently beating up on her, and she had bruises and didn't want to go live with her family because she didn't want her parents to know about the abusive relationship. She was just asked under cross-examination, did you know that she dated Sydney Moore? And she says, I didn't know anything about this relationship and didn't know that Tammy was apparently threatening her. So again, I'm here with Brad Micklin, trial attorney. What's the value of this witness, the value of this testimony?
I think the reason that she's called is I think they're trying to give some reason to the jury of why this young lady might have disappeared. If she had an abusive boyfriend in the past and maybe he resurfaced, she would flee. Because I think once the defense took the step of putting on a defense, they have to answer that question of, if she's not here, why wouldn't we hear from her?
So in other words, that perhaps she just went missing. Perhaps she went up. So we've seen these cases before where there's no body. Shouldn't the prosecution put in some evidence to say, Here are statistics out there of people who have gone missing. And how many people have gone missing? There is absolutely no trace of them whatsoever. No cell phone records, no camera footage, nothing out there, which would indicate to somebody that a person didn't go missing and escape. They went missing because they were killed. So, I mean, how much of that evidence should be put in here?
I don't think any of that evidence should go in. A statistic about whether people go missing or are murdered really isn't relevant to whether or not Tammy Moore and her husband did anything unlawful here. But I think the bigger question that the prosecution should have presented, or the bigger issue they should have, is that she had no reason to leave. She was a young girl, she had some friends, she worked in a restaurant. Why would she just pick up and disappear?
That's a great question. All right, we got a new witness on the stand. We're going to learn a little bit more of this story. Let's go live into that South Carolina courtroom. Brad, what's the purpose of this witness? I'm not really sure I'm getting much from it.
I'm not sure either. And if we're sitting here uncertain, you know, the jury's baffled. The only thing I could surmise is maybe they're just trying to put so much information that the jury gets confused, or they think, well, that was reasonable doubt because we don't know, we don't understand. Otherwise, I don't see any purpose behind it.
Yeah, he doesn't really know Heather Elvis that well. Didn't know her relationship with Sydney Moore. Didn't know about her relationship with Tammy Moore. And really didn't have that much contact with the victim. So we're all wondering what the purpose of this witness is. It should be noted that the defense's case was kind of undercut a little bit yesterday because they wanted to call the Moore children. They were not permitted to testify because of violating that sequestration order. So I wonder where they're going next in their case.
Hopefully to Tammy.
That's what we're all waiting for. We are waiting for Tammy Moore to take the stand. I believe we have to take a quick break, so we're going to do that right now. Okay, I'm here with trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, when you call a witness, there's a purpose.
You would hope.
What's the purpose here?
I don't know. And the worst part about it was nobody here in studio had any idea what this witness was about until the prosecutor's cross-examination. Then it seemed to suggest that maybe the defense was trying to suggest that he kidnapped Heather.
So why not call me to the stand and say that I had something to do with it? I mean, again, what's the relationship? There's no real relationship. Is it just anybody that had contact with her? It makes no sense. Why would they do that? Doesn't that hurt their case, the credibility of their case?
I think so. I think it looks like a lawyer trick. If you're going to call a witness to suggest that this witness may have committed this heinous crime, you want to be able to show it pretty clearly. You don't want, obviously, he's not going to admit, yes, I kidnapped her, but you want to be able to tie together either by testimony or by impeachment that maybe he was the person who did it, not to just suggest it, which is what they weekly did here.
Who are they going to call next? The pizza delivery guy that delivered pizzas to her apartment? I mean, really, like, I'm not sure I get it because, again, we're talking about how can't they just win a successful case based upon the prosecution not having a lot in theirs?
I think so, and if they hadn't opened the door and started this case down this road, they wouldn't have to. If they had just moved after the prosecution's case to say they didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, because remember, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, and there's a lot of doubt here. But now they're opening the door to all these issues and making the defendant look worse with each different witness that they call.
Now, we are waiting to see if she will be called to the stand. It appears what they would do if they want to call her, she's going to testify as the last witness. Is that what you're seeing? I mean, they're calling these other witnesses. Why not have her start the testimony, or is it more strong and more compelling for her to be the last witness, the last thing that people hear?
I think it's compelling for her to be the last witness if she has something meaningful to say and if she's a good witness. I don't anticipate she's going to have either anything good to say, and I don't think she's going to appear as a good witness. It's a bad case for them. There's an ugly situation. There's her husband, which I'm sure the jury doesn't know, that's already in prison for this, and there's a woman missing. No good comes from Tammy getting on the stand to try to clarify it.
Yeah, he's in prison for 10 years for obstruction of justice. His kidnapping trial ended in a mistrial. All the murder charges were dropped against him and Tammy. We have a new witness on the stand. Let's maybe see if this witness has a little bit more to say. Okay, we got to talk about what the defense is doing right here. I'm here with Brad Micklin. After seeing the testimony of Timothy Tyndall, who really didn't add much, now we got a guy who comes on the stand who says, I thought I saw Heather Elvis after she disappeared, but I was wrong. What's going on here?
You would think this would be like that quintessential smoking gun where, isn't it true you kidnapped her? And it's how it seems to be presented, that they wanted to show that he saw her the next day. But the way it's being presented and the questions that he's answering suggest that he was mistaken, that he said it was Saturday, but it was Friday, and there was a video that there was a tattoo or not a tattoo, and I guess there was a timing issue when she got it, that it couldn't have been her or couldn't have been that date. So what could have been this big smoking gun just looked like a big waste of time.
The idea of what the defense is doing is trying to raise reasonable doubt that perhaps she was not kidnapped or killed, but something else happened to her.
Right, but that's such a mistake, though, because it's not the defense burden to raise reasonable doubt. It's prosecution's burden to prove beyond the reasonable doubt that she was kidnapped, that Tammy abducted, carried, and detained this person. A lot of people think that. It's common to say, well, the defendant's raising reasonable doubt, but it's not her burden to do that, and she shouldn't even be trying to.
So is the defense want to say in their closing argument, they say she has a presumption of innocence, the prosecution hasn't met that burden. And one of the reasons why is, look, you have one witness who said maybe he saw her, you have another guy that knew her, and maybe that's reasonable doubt that there's something else could have happened to her, but is this just not an effective way to do it?
I think it's both. I think that they're going to use this as a closing to say there's so many different options here, we don't know what it could be. But I think that's a mistake, because what I think they're doing is, instead of just presenting to the jury, hey, we don't know what happened here, they're almost suggesting that something bad did happen, but it might have been these other people that did it. And you don't want to send the jury back with that kind of a message, because then they're going to want to make somebody pay for that. And that would be Tammy.
Yeah, and we're all wondering when or if she will take the stand. That's what we're all waiting for Tammy Moore to take the stand in this case. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in that South Carolina courtroom.
Preview.
Okay, so you might be wondering, why is this witness coming to the stand? Well, our producer is telling us that in Sydney Moore's trial, there was a whole discussion about whether or not Tammy was in fact pregnant, and perhaps these records would show that, because that becomes a big issue in terms of that pregnancy test. You remember that there was a question of whether Heather Elvis was pregnant. So Brad, if that's the question of whether Tammy was pregnant, it could explain away some certain motive, I guess.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think it's a big piece. I'm not sure if this witness is here to say that Tammy was pregnant, or they're here to say that Sydney tried to suggest that Tammy was pregnant and may have offered false records to do so, because I think he was sentenced on an obstruction charge. So I don't know if that was what the nature of it was. I know his truck was sold afterwards. So I'm really curious to see what records she's here about.
Okay, let's go live and we'll learn a little bit more. All right, so we're getting an idea here of what the defense is doing, trying to explain away some of the evidence put forward by the prosecution, including the fact that Sydney Moore bought this pregnancy test at Walmart. We presumed that it was for Heather Elvis, because if she was pregnant, it would give him perhaps an incentive or a motive to get rid of her, and you would see that Tammy obviously would be upset about it, and you can get the story. But if Tammy was the one who was really pregnant, then maybe there's a different story here. Brad, what's your perspective on this?
I think so. I think this is probably the only witness so far that might actually help the case. If the prosecution is going to really rely or strongly rely on the fact that he bought the test because Heather was pregnant, that would give Tammy motivation and motive to want to kidnap her. And that might explain why Tammy's getting on the stand. Tammy might get up and say, no, we were trying to get pregnant since 2012.
Yeah, and so he bought this test and then went right to the payphone to call Heather. That could be a suspicious move. On the other hand, you could look at it and say, well, wait a second. Maybe Tammy finally let him out of the house. He gets this pregnancy test and calls Heather to explain the situation that, hey, she's pregnant, or we think she might be pregnant here.
Yeah, the phone call is strange because it still does suggest that he bought it for Heather. But hopefully we'll find out either through the records here or through Tammy when she finally takes a stand.
Yeah, I want to confirm right now that, yep, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Stay tuned. Okay, so just if you're joining us, Tammy was in custody when she was taken to the ER and had this pregnancy test. 2 days before that, she had been in court asking for a bond, saying that she was pregnant. At the time, the prosecutor said they didn't know if she was really pregnant, so and that she had refused the test. Again, back here with Brad Micklin, trying to understand, don't they have bigger issues to tackle here than the pregnancy test? Or really, that's an important factor. I'm curious what you think about the pregnancy issue.
I don't know. I keep going back and forth as we get further into it, because on the one hand, maybe they're going to argue, the defense is going to argue that she was pregnant 9 months earlier and that's why the husband bought the test. Or it could be that she was pregnant 9 days earlier and she had an affair with somebody while she was incarcerated. I have no idea where they're going with it.
And again, we're all focusing on this because it was believed that Heather Elvis may have been pregnant at the time of her disappearance, which would have given Tammy Moore incentive or motive to make sure that this woman who had an affair with her husband and had her baby would have a reason to get rid of her. Let's go live. Okay, so this is getting even more bizarre, putting the prosecution in the hot seat, trying to explain this whole pregnancy issue. Again, we're trying to see who was pregnant. Was it Heather Elvis? Was it Tammy Moore? Was Sidney Moore buying a pregnancy test for Heather or for his wife? One thing that should be noted is that there was a statement made by Sidney Moore where he said that he was buying that pregnancy test for his wife. This came out in his trial, and that he said his wife was in the car when he went into that Walmart to buy the pregnancy test, which is strange because we know that right after he bought that pregnancy test, he went on a payphone and tried to call Heather Elvis. So Tammy was in the car while this was happening. Again, very bizarre thing that's happening here. I'm back here with Brad Micklin. We knew today was going to be bizarre. We thought that Tammy might testify, but this is just a different kind of line of testimony.
Yeah, and they keep spending so much time on it that you think it's going to become relevant. And I don't have any idea what Sidney's statements, if they're even going to come into here, would have anything to do with it, because we can't really trust what he's going to say about any of the situation. But none of it makes any sense. And maybe, again, that's why they're planning to bring both husband and wife to testify and clear it all up.
We saw at the beginning part of the testimony there was some indication that the defense was trying to say that perhaps Heather Elvis is still out there. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Do you think that they needed to expand upon that?
If they raised it, they probably should have expanded, because I think it's a mistake to raise that. It's not believable that she's out there somewhere and just remained silent for all these years from her friends and her family, and now that there's a murder trial before and there's a kidnapping trial now, and she's just remaining quiet. It doesn't make any sense. They shouldn't have even brought it up.
Yeah. This is just, and you see these pictures of this young girl, beautiful young 20-year-old girl, never seen from again since 2013. How eerie are these kinds of cases when we don't have a body and we don't know what happened? I mean, there's always some kind of evidence, always something that can point to what happened to somebody.
Yeah, and that's the worst part about this, is the jury's going to be sitting there saying, what happened to her? Not only do we have to decide if something happened to her, but we have to decide, do we punish this woman, Tammy, because we think she did it to her? And you're always sympathetic when somebody goes missing, especially a young girl like this. And it leaves the jury kind of pressured to try to do the right thing, and nobody knows what that is.
When you don't have a body, is it easier to prosecute a murder case or can kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap case? Because we know that the murder charges against the Moores were dropped.
I think it's harder to prosecute a murder case without a body, because again, like I said earlier, it's circumstantial and upon circumstantial. Kidnapping implicitly suggests you won't have a body, because if you did have a body, the body would either be dead, which would then be a murder charge, or the person would be alive and testifying to the kidnapping. So the absence of a person, I think, actually strengthens the prosecution's case.
We know that this trial is going to extend into next week. We're waiting to see if Tammy Moore will take the stand today, but we're also waiting to see what other witnesses will be called by the defense, if any. What kind of witnesses do you think they need to call, if any?
I don't know. It depends. I think the bigger question is going to be next week, after Tammy does testify, assuming that she does. What rebuttal witnesses are they going to be bringing in? Is there going to be other records that come in, other people that Tammy may have spoke to when she was incarcerated? None of this would be necessarily relevant until she takes the stand.
And I suppose there's a question of whether or not the Moores, Sidney, and Tammy will have a united front, or whether they'll point the finger at one another.
Which would then go possibly to the conspiracy charge, though.
Yeah, I mean, this could get very messy in the next couple of days.
Right, and the husband, I think, can still be tried again.
Yes,
so it's unlikely that he's going to expose that, because if he gets up and says to Tammy, or says Tammy did it, he knows she's going to say he did it, and then he's likely to be prosecuted again for it.
It's like a bad Lifetime movie, I'll tell you that much. Brad Micklin, thanks so much for coming on. It was great to have your perspective, and you got to come back here soon.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Of course. All right, everybody, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in that Tammy Moore trial, that South Carolina courtroom. And as you can imagine, you don't want to miss anything. Stay tuned here on Law&Crime.